called VIP, Vegan Information Project. So kind of like an ethical vegan group. And so we're doing a mini course at the moment, which is using a bit of philosophy, but mainly it's kind of social movement theory and a case study on animal advocacy, which I'm doing. But thankfully not today, I haven't got a week off. So we've got two speakers today, and my job is to introduce Frank Armstrong here, who is a writer and a teacher and a part-time chef. So I don't know whether it just means that all his food is lukewarm at the end of it. And he came to the issue of veganism through the environmental route, essentially, and now says he's adopted an animal rights perspective. That's right, isn't it, Frank?
I'm still learning.
Well, that's the blurb you gave me. So, Frank.
Thanks, Roger. Roger asked me to do this. Probably the only way to shut me up from being when I'm in the crowd. So I'm going to talk about the history of Irish food and how that might relate to the vegan approach. Some people would say, if you're talking about history of Irish food, well, this won't take long. But you know, through history, people have been eating 2 meals a day, so there is an important social history alongside it, and particularly in the case of Ireland, where we've had one of the worst famines in human history. So it's been a very important consideration, food, for throughout Irish history. And we like to think of, people say today it's more important than ever, but actually in the past it was much more important. So a history of Irish food will probably make for quite uncomfortable. Is quite an uncomfortable study, maybe, for people who come from a vegan approach, because there has been throughout Irish history, throughout the acquisition of food in Irish history, there has been animal use. So any kind of vegan approach is a radical departure. I believe that it's a correct approach, because I think we are now tied into a global chain of supply, and it's incumbent upon us to create a more harmonious world, and a world where climate change is not such a problem. And also, I think there's compelling evidence that our health is served by a plant-based diet. So I have on the first page of the little handout, I have a chronology of Irish food and agriculture, which is also really a chronology of human history, because human history is first and foremost, I suppose, how people survive, and food is a prime, is always a primary consideration. So you look back on human history in Ireland, it's a very short period, really. Human beings have only been here for just over 10,000 years. And when you think of the history of the world, or even the history of other animals, it's a very short time. But in that time, we have made a massive impact on the environment here. We like to think, we look at our countryside today and we see fields, with animals generally grazing in them. But this is not very much not the natural environment, or the climax vegetation in Ireland. Ireland would be a huge forest if it wasn't for the impact of human farming, and that is, as we all know, the impact of animal husbandry, as it's termed, animal use, has a much greater impact than growing crops for direct human consumption. And it's also the case that we like to think of there's a sort of a romantic idea that maybe in the past people lived in balance with nature. But actually there are plenty of examples from from human history to show that prehistoric communities did not necessarily live in balance with nature. I don't know if anyone's read any of Jared Diamond's work, but he looks at the history of people like the Easter Islanders, who cut down all the trees in their island, and the island went into ecological collapse, and over half the population was wiped out. So that was not Western man, it was not imperialism, but it was a prehistoric community. So it's not just, you know, in the modern phase that we've seen rapid destruction of our environment. It's also in the prehistoric era. So really, I think the vegan approach, this very radical idea, it offers the potential for a new way for humans to inhabit their environment, a less stressful, imposing less stress on other creatures, allowing for greater biodiversity, and ultimately having healthier lives themselves. So we look at then the history of human settlement. So humans arrive. I think initially they would have walked to Ireland before ocean levels. They're harvesting food, they are foraging plants, and they're hunting animals from their first arrival. But there was very low population density. It couldn't sustain that environment can't sustain very many humans. What's more, and I think recent research has shown that there was a high mortality rate, violent mortality rate among these communities, probably because of hunting, because hunting will give people access to weapons, and often these weapons are turned against other human beings as well. So there's an interaction there between violence against animals and violence against humans. So then, but all the same, I suppose, you know, when you look at that form of or mode of production, as I suppose it would be termed, it was much less invasive of the environment, on the environment. It had much less of an impact, and you know, humans were very much a part of nature. They were only slowly being enslaving nature, as we might put it, which is what occurred when agriculture emerged. So agriculture emerged in a few different places around the globe, and actually almost simultaneously in China and the Middle East. And it's the Middle East which really has the most impact on Europe, and that's where wheat, barley, and the few domesticated animals came about, where domestication of animals came about. So this kind of toolkit, it spread across Europe. Now, it's not clear whether it's by conquest, but what's clear is that once you establish agriculture, it's very difficult for other modes of production to survive. And actually these early agricultural societies, the life expectancy decreased because they had much less of a variety of food. And there's a lot more control in this environment because the king or the pharaoh or whatever it is has to control the seed stock, so that when the following year comes about, you can grow your crops. So this spread across Europe and wipes out other forms of human food production. And it comes to Ireland in about 4000 BC, so that's about just over 6,000 years ago. And temperatures may have been a bit warmer than today, because we see even in this short phase of human history fluctuations in climate in Ireland. So immediately there's an impact, the impact of agriculture and the loping down of trees and the slash and burn agriculture, and especially connected to the domesticated animals that arrive with the human beings. And we see evidence of that in the burn today. Everybody talks about how wonderful the burn is. They have these little flowers that come from some are alpine, some are Mediterranean or something, and people are very keen on this. But actually, it's a very modified landscape that has been that was destroyed by overgrazing in the Stone Age. So then we get to a point where human beings start using metal, and that again has a big impact, because what can you make out of metal, but weapons, and also ploughs. So this leads to further intensification, probably some population growth. And then you have the Iron Age in 1400. Later, we see the arrival of extensive dairying through the year. Previously, cattle had been kept for their meat. But we see in Ireland a tension between tillage on the one hand, growing crops for direct human consumption, and raising animals for slaughter or for exploitation. And this shifts, and it could be cultural. It may not be that it's necessary. Some people would say, oh, today we have the best conditions for growing grass in Europe, therefore we have to raise cattle, and that's how we'll make our billions out of it. But actually, we see throughout the history of Irish agriculture shifts in production, so depending on what is demanded, both by the external market and by consumer demand. So when monasticism emerges in Ireland after St. Patrick's arrival in the 5th century, there's a surge in tillage, because monks were overwhelmingly vegetarian at least, and possibly even had plant-based diets. So we also see in this period water mills, which were kind of unique in Europe at that time, and some of the first examples since Roman times. And the society breaks down somewhat with the Viking incursions. They bring more sophisticated methods of keeping animals. So they use hay that they harvest in the summer, and they give to animals in the winter. And also they bring technology of fishing to the Irish, because previously and throughout Irish history, fishing hasn't been a major, or sea fishing hasn't been a major factor, probably because of our quite rough seas. Then we see the Norman arrival. Again, there's a surge in tillage production. They're bringing more of the English model of production. And I just want to refer now to, I have some notes that I've made from secondary sources. Some of the main authors on the subject, so John Phelan and Fergus Kelly and so on, and Raymond Crotty. And so you see in Gaelic culture, so with the arrival of dairying, you see very much a diet that shows a dominance of dairy, actually, according to the sources. You know, particularly in the western part of the country. And the question I think I have in this is whether this is a product of culture or a necessity, or you know, whether people are finding that growing crops is too unreliable in the Irish climate, or whether there is a sort of nobility that seeks to impose this, in a sense. My sense is that it is actually more a product of culture, and there's some evidence for this, because there was endemic warfare in Irish conditions, because cattle raiding was a way for young men to show their prowess, and that sort of perpetuates the system, and also militates against the development of more intensive tillage or horticulture. And also, when you have this dominant pastoralism, you find that a lot of the wild environment is ruined and uprooted. So there are less wild food sources. For example, hazelnuts, which were for the early farmers, they were apparently as important in the diet as grain. So actually, removing the trees, you know, removes also another source of food. So interestingly, though, is the relationship between human beings and cattle. I think it's a subject that I find quite interesting. We see a sort of a veneration of cows. So, for example, an old Irish prayer to the Blessed Virgin, where she is addressed as an ever-milking cow. And there are plenty more examples of this from the sources, of a strong relationship, almost intimate relationship between human beings and cows. But, of course, the male cattle were apparently killed when they were born. They weren't kept. They weren't raised for their meat. They were actually slaughtered. But it's interesting because there seems to be a slight taboo against eating meat at this stage. The meat did not feature prominently in the diet. It was very much a dairy-based diet. So one of the authors says there are no beef-eating heroes in Irish mythology. The doughtiest Irish warriors relied on pig meat, and pigs did arrive with the first conquest as well. So that's the scene in Gaelic Ireland, where cities did not emerge, because without a sort of a vibrant agriculture that produces crops, it's very difficult to have cities. If you have an entirely pastoral society, you have a low density of population, and so cities were not present in Gaelic Ireland. It was only the Vikings who brought cities. So Dublin is a Viking city, because there simply weren't enough reserves of food to sustain a city. So we come then to the potato. Now, some authors have the potato emerges, comes to Ireland about 1600 from the Americas. So we associate Ireland with potatoes, but of course it's not indigenous. And there are some authors are very critical of the effect of the potato, that it reduced the amount of food that people could eat. But on the other hand, it allowed people to live on very little land. So and it was a very productive crop for for 250 years. And we see a huge, massive population explosion from something like under 2 million in 1600 to almost 9 million in 1850. And that could never have been achieved if the Gaelic mode of production, i.e. pastoral farming, had remained in place. But the problem with the potato in Ireland was that it was the fallback food for people. It wasn't there wasn't enough diversity in the diet. So people were living on very small patches of land and were, because of the colonization that had occurred, and had little scope for variety in their diets. And this is obviously a product of the colonization that occurred, especially the plantations, which began at the end of, or which began in the 16th century and progressed through the 17th. So in the 18th century, then we had the penal laws, which further restricted the extent to which the majority of the population could, enjoy different careers and so on. That was actually a period of growth, and to an extent this was because of what were known as the Cattle Acts. And these were acts of the English Parliament, which operated, which affected Ireland, which said that cattle could not be exported from Ireland directly. But that led to the development of a provisions trade, and that involved cattle meat and also tillage, an enhanced tillage sector. So, but economically, the 18th century was quite good for the Irish population, despite the penal laws. And as we've seen, we have this huge population growth. Now, some among the early imperialists in the 17th century saw the potential for turning Ireland into a large kind of farm, essentially, for cattle. Sir William Petty actually prepared proposals in 1687 for turning Ireland into a vast sheep and cattle ranch. Petty believed that Ireland was capable of carrying 6 million head of cattle, which he suggested could be most economically tended by a population of some 300,000. The surplus population was to be removed to England, where they would become labourers. So this gives you an idea of the population, the effect of population on population of having so many cattle. And actually today we have more than 6 million cattle in Ireland. We'll come to that. So Ireland's Irish agriculture was very much influenced by the demands of the English market. In the 18th century and up to the Battle of Waterloo, England demanded grain from Ireland. So that was what Ireland produced. But after that, it became clear that England could get grain from much cheaper on the international market, mainly from America. And we see the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, which is another crucial date in the history of Irish agriculture. And from 1815, the pressure was on to convert Ireland into the kind of ranch which someone like Sir William Petty had envisaged. And so farmers were squeezed more and more into smaller holdings. And we see during the famine, out of a total acreage of 20 million, 3 million of the population were on 1 million. So there are great inequalities in the system. And eventually, when the potato blight struck in 1845, these 3 million especially who were on this tiny acreage were very vulnerable, and a great many of them died. Up to 1 million of them died, and 1 million of them emigrated. And this gave the opportunity to those who wished to convert Ireland to pasture to proceed. And so in the late 19th century we see the spread of the pastoral farming model. And this leads to great population decline in that period, and an increase in the cattle population. But what happens also is we like to think in Ireland of it being the English against the Irish and so on, but it's not. It doesn't work that way. Actually, there were Irish farmers who were profiting from the famine, who were gaining bigger holdings, who could then convert their small farms into larger farms and buy cattle and sell them on the market, and they become a sort of petty bourgeois class. So this continues through the 19th century, and we see obviously this cycle of emigration and declining population continuing. So, and it continues into the history of the Free State. So to a point where the population of Ireland in the early 1960s is under 4 million, having been up to 9 million. And this is mainly a product of the declining rural population, because people have been essentially cleared off the land. And the Irish peasantry have, in the meantime, inherited the land. They have through a succession of land acts in the late 19th century, they purchased the land, and this class essentially has become the dominant class, the dominant political class in the state. So we see little shift in the production priorities of Irish agriculture. And this is a low employment model, because putting cattle in a field doesn't require work, it doesn't require labour to any great extent, compared to horticulture, compared to tillage. It's a very low employment model. And but that though that elite have dominated both of the main political parties in Ireland since the inception of the state, and there has been no discernible left-wing political formation in Ireland, except the Labour Party, who obviously have never formed a majority government. So the farming, this farming class have tended to dominate and to perpetuate their model, and this was given sanctioned by the state in the 1960s, and given further impetus by membership of the European Community in 1972, after which farmers began to receive support, income support, farm income support, and including headage payments. So they're paid for the amount of sheep they have on their farm, and this again causes grave damage to the environment. So the boglands are ruined by overgrazing. We don't replant any of the forests that have been removed over centuries, to a point where, upon independence, Ireland had the lowest percentage of forests of any country in Europe, the lowest coverage of forest. And of course, today we have the issue of climate change, and the livestock that we have are manipulated and overbred are producing 30% of the emissions in this country. So it's a very damaging form of farming, and it has a very high impact on biodiversity and climate change. And I think that the example of the potato shows that we can get a lot more bang for our buck in terms of what we devote the land to. We can't grow everything in Irish conditions, but we can certainly do a hell of a lot better. And unfortunately, the agricultural authorities are not, Tagish in particular, who are the organisation responsible for agricultural research, are doing nothing almost to further research in the area. And the country, quite apart from the slaughter of animals, it's a very bad economic model going forward. You just have to look at things like the fodder crisis, the foot and mouth crisis, the horse meat crisis, the BSE crisis. All these things show that this is a very vulnerable model. When you have this kind of monoculture, as it's called in agriculture, in agricultural terms, you have a system that's very vulnerable to disease, essentially. We saw it in Ireland in the 1840s when too many of the population were dependent on one crop, and we see it today when the country is dependent on raising cattle for milk and for slaughter. So you know, and when they boast of the 10 billion in export revenues, we're ignoring how we import 5 billion worth of food. We're ignoring how when we produce food in this way, we're not producing healthy alternatives. You know, when we devote our land exclusively to livestock, or the land that we find ourselves custodians over, it's a very bad model. And all these income supports are going to farmers who themselves are not doing well. Something like 80% of farmers who raise cattle for beef are losing money. The same applies to something like 40% of dairy farmers. The people who are making money are the large companies, the Kerry groups of this world, who are very keen to maintain the present priorities and to maintain the subsidy regime that keeps farmers locked into this model. And in a sense, the farmers, most of the farmers are victims of this system. They're trying to make a living, they're trying to live in the same place, and this is the option that's given to them. They could be given money to restore forestry, and admittedly there are some grants available, but that should be much more of a priority in my view. If we think of the energy resources that we need going forward, with fossil fuels running out, with climate change, clearly we have to change our model. So I've been, but that's not the case, and that's not the ambition, because if you look at the latest document, Harvest 2020, it targets a 33% increase in output. So they pay lip service to greening Irish agriculture, but actually it's just a marketing exercise. Mm-hmm. You can't, it's a fact of life that cattle produce methane, which will have an effect on global warming, on climate change. So I suppose I think it has to be the ambition of all of us to raise awareness of this, and to, it doesn't matter, to say to people, it doesn't matter if you may not subscribe to an animal rights perspective, you may not be an animal welfarist, but at least you want to prevent climate change, and that's that is the major should be at least a major political question of our day. When you see the projections, it's really scary. Sorry, I've been sort of talking, and I'm giving it. I tried to give a sort of a whistle-stop tour of 10,000 years. So it was a little bit of a challenge to do that. But has anyone got anything to say or any response?
Any questions or observations? Actually, if you want a short, if you want a slower version, then subscribe to Frank's UCD course. Because, as I said, whistle stop. But anybody got any comments, observations, or questions?
I'll do that in 16 hours as opposed to 40 minutes.
To add to that, I'm recently back from a health conference in New York. It's called The Real Truth About Health. And there was a guy there called Richard Oppenlander, who seemed to be a pretty serious scientist who's written a book. I can't remember the name of it, but Richard Oppenlander in great detail went into the effects of raising cattle for food on the climate, on global warming, and said that it contributed way more than all the fossil fuel burning on the planet, including air travel. Much, much, much more. Somewhere between 30 and 60%.
Yeah.
30% is very conservative, apparently.
Yeah.
But if you're serious about this subject, you might look up Richard Oppenlander.
There's an article by Goodland and Anhang where they estimate 48%. Though the UN most recently have said 17%.
17.
And that's their estimate. But that's even the UN estimate, which is conservative, very conservative by all accounts, is much more than all the transport that occurs. So, yeah.
Frank, thank you. I want to ask, because yes, we're familiar with climate change problem and animal rights and everything, but I'm wondering that kind of, to my very limited knowledge, there is still very little about Irish situation, you know. So it's still, Ireland is still portrayed as a green island, and many actually environmentalists told me that the island is in very good situation, and I'm kind of really struggling to kind of understand. You know, I understand that, as you said, the very kind of powerful groups, they try to maintain the existing order, you know, and in that respect, yes, kind of grazing cows, you know, beautiful green landscape is kind of part of that picture. But could you tell a little bit more about the actual situation in Ireland?
The fact that we didn't have an industrial revolution of any significance, at least in the south, means people assume that our environment is much cleaner, and it is the case also that the pollution from pastoral farming is quite different to the pollution emanating from tillage. So there might be more artificial fertilizers used in tillage. So, you know, it's a low intensity model, and you know, and you see in the Irish scenery, it looks quite wild, but it's not. That's not the climax vegetation. The climax vegetation is oak forest in most of the oak and elm and oak and hazel.
But what about animal agriculture? I don't hear any information, you know, in relation to how potentially animal agriculture affects Irish ecology. I'm wondering, is it possible?
Well, there's
apart from your articles, of course. Yeah.
But actually, there's a kind of quite a dominant sort of discourse suggesting that the benefit, this sort of co-evolution between man and the environment and cattle, and that, you know, the cattle are good for the grass and you know, maintain the fertility of the soil, and you know, in the Burren, which I referred to, there are these you know, these flowers that that have emerged through the interaction of grazing and human grazing of animals, and people see this as a wonderful sort of development, even though it's a desert, really. It's almost a desert. It's almost bare rock. But that's the sort of dominant discourse, because if you start attacking agriculture, you're attacking your own community, and it's a small country. So people don't like. I have an uncle who's a small farmer, he's a part-time farmer, and probably doesn't make very much money out of it. But there are a lot of people in that situation. So it's sort of a bit of a taboo, you know. You don't, and you listen to RTE, and you know they want to look after the Irish people. They don't want to attack, you know, people who have been doing a job that's seen as natural, seen as the normal thing to do. Even though it's actually quite a modern innovation to have this commodification of agriculture that occurs really, you know, in the late 19th century especially.
Is there a final question, maybe?
Under the agreements with the greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
I was just watching Equality, I think it was last night, you know, Ireland is supposed to bring down the emissions by 20% by the year 20, by the year 50 by 80%.
Yeah.
Like, how are they going to do that?
Impossible.
You know, increasing the farm, you know.
Yeah, I mean
and
that's.
they're being fined at the moment some 100 million every year, like, for that already, you know. Not meet the targets even now, you know, so.
Well, if we reduce it by 80%, already 30% of our emissions are coming from agriculture. We can't do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that an Irish stat, or is that just?
Yeah,
No. In Irish they say it's 30%. It's probably higher, because if you convert that land to forestry, you can get carbon sinks. So
yeah, but they're doing absolutely nothing about. The government is doing nothing about this 20% of the year.
well, governments last for 5 years, and they look after their own. I mean, like they're already changing the rules on turf cutting. Because of the local elections, even though this is a unique natural environment, that they're because electoral mathematics suggests they should do so, that they allow people to ruin that environment. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, but like killing parties, so the average Joe Soap is paying these hundreds of millions even now, like, you know, so why isn't there a debate about that, you know, that can be
because there's such bias in the media. And also I think when people have a certain diet, they become very defensive about it. And they see it as an inheritance, as part of their cultural inheritance, and a cultural right for them to continue with that diet. Getting people to shift diet, and whatever, clothes or whatever else, but in particular diet, I think is a hugely difficult exercise. People very much cling to the food of their childhood. Sociologists observe this, how people hold on to that almost more than anything else in life. It's this sort of nostalgia that people have for whatever it is they grew up with, and getting people to shift diet. I mean, probably individuals know this themselves. Actually, giving up something is very difficult. But when it's very once you do it, you kind of go, well, I've done that. That was easy. But actually, getting people to that point is, and you might. I know myself that I was sort of fighting against it and making arguments against it, and not listening to maybe sense, the sense it made. But people, so people don't want to, they don't want to do without butter on their bread and their Sunday roast and their, this is my entitlement. I've worked for this, So I think that's a major stumbling block.
Well, certainly in terms of sociology, one thing that sociologists will say that people are very conservative when it comes to their food, so it's quite right. So I think we'll have to pull that to thing. Obviously, we're going to have you back, Frank, because that wasn't long enough. So I'd like you to thank Frank, and then we've got some.